Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I am in the midst of some minor bit of life-changing. Because I am the most boring guy in the world, life-changing consists of my getting a new lounge chair to replace the comfy leather chair that's served me in pretty good stead for almost 20 years now. And that's prompted some rearranging in my library and home office, which I realized I really needed after the last few years of seclusion in this space. I haven't had the breaks of going to trade shows, traveling, etc. I've been down here in my library and office almost 2 years now since the pandemic really took off. And moving things around a little and opening up the space, I needed to do that. Maybe you guys do too. Now, I bid farewell to the chair this weekend with a binge reading of Donald Hall's amazing book, Old Poets, which is a reissue of Their Ancient Glittering Eyes, which came out in the 90s, which is a updated version of a book he did in the 70s. Anyway, it's a collection of essays about poets that Hall either knew or studied with or interviewed. Well, either studied with or interviewed. Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, Archibald MacLeish, Ivor Winters, Marianne Moore, and Ezra Pound. I got that in order. I'm going to try and write more about that book in this week's email and about Hall and about the nature of, I don't want to say regret, but I'll get into that. But I did just want to mention it here, Old Poets by Donald Hall, because I feel like it transmitted me into another world. And I'm hoping some of you will share that experience. Next week, maybe I'll tell you how the new lounge chair works out. But for now, let's get on with the show. Now, last week was a Holocaust-themed episode, and next week is about Vladimir Putin. So in between, I figured we should get a little lighter this time around. With Valentine's Day coming up, I figured this would be a great time to talk with Scott Meslow about his brand new book, From Hollywood with Love, The Rise and Fall and Rise Again of the Romantic Comedy. It came out last week from Day Street Books, and it's a fun but thorough exploration of the modern rom-com from When Harry Met Sally through the present-day mini renaissance on streaming services like Netflix. Now, rom-coms may seem like a frivolous topic, but they actually have a lot to tell us about gender, the economics of entertainment, diversity and how it's represented, and a lot more. And a lot that I wasn't thinking of going into this book. But Scott does a fantastic job in From Hollywood with Love of showing how each of the 15 main movies in his chronology were made and how they came together, how they were received, what their implications were, and what they said about the world in which they were released, I guess, and how they've aged in good and bad ways. So the book is structured with 16 main chapters about individual movies, those 15 plus one that was never made. And those are intercut with essays about particular actors like Hugh Grant, Meg Ryan, John Cusack, my all-time fave, Judy Greer, and more. I don't know. I just want to say From Hollywood with Love is an awful lot of fun, even when it's filling you in on some of the not so pleasant sides of the industry and the viewing public and the media. And like I say, a lot of the discourse I mentioned above about how rom-coms are perceived and what sort of genre ghetto they're put in certain ways. Anyway, what I want to get at is that, above all, From Hollywood with Love is a hopeful book about a genre that gets dismissed way too easily as just, chick movies. And as I mentioned in our conversation, I came into it thinking this was all going to be alien territory for me, like it was going to be some novel thing that I was exploring rom-coms in an episode of the show. But once I started going through the chapters, I realized I'd seen 9 out of the 15 movies that Scott focuses on, as well as a bunch of others that get mentioned throughout the book. For the record, the ones that I've seen were When Harry Met Sally, Pretty Woman, Four Weddings and a Funeral, There's Something About Mary, Bridget Jones' Diary, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Love Actually, Knocked Up, and Crazy Rich Asians. The ones I haven't seen are Waiting to Exhale, My Best Friend's Wedding, How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, Something's Gotta Give, Friends with Benefits, and To All the Boys I've Loved Before. Now, I can't say I loved every rom-com in that list that I saw, but 600 batting average is a lot higher than I am with, Marvel movies and other things that are super popular in this world. So hey, now as the conversation's going to explore, Scott gets into a lot of the subversion going on with this genre, which occurs almost from day one. And you'll notice that I mentioned There's Something About Mary among the rom-coms, and he makes a very good case as to why it's in there. And that's not the only one that tweaks the ideas of what these sorts of movies should be and what an audience is really looking for and what actually delivers for them. Anyway, go check out From Hollywood with Love and, maybe put on a rom-com or two to celebrate Valentine's Day, whether or not you got someone to celebrate with. Now, here's Scott's bio from the book. There's a more extensive one at his website, scottmeslow.com. Scott Meslow is a senior editor at The Week magazine, that's WEEK, and a writer and critic for publications including GQ, New York Magazine, and The Atlantic. From Hollywood with Love is his first book. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Scott Meslow. Define the terms for rom-com for me, and then we'll talk about where the book comes from. But, I know you mentioned it in the beginning, but, for the listeners, how do we define what a romantic comedy is?
Yeah, this is a favorite subject for me because I think there's a lot of confusion about what constitutes a rom-com. So when I was kind of sitting down to figure out what the book was, I realized I need to have a working definition that is going to make it clear which movies count for my book and which ones don't. And it ended up being pretty simple. The first thing is it needs to make me laugh more than it makes me sad. That puts it into the com instead of the dram category. As for the rom, if there is a romantic plot in the movie, if you pull it out, is there still a movie or not? And if the answer is no, then it's a rom-com.
Yeah, and I appreciated that for something, as you bring up, like Miss Congeniality, which is a fine movie with Sandra Bullock, but not in the rom-com mode, because if you take out the romance, you still have the story that's there.
Right.
So.
That is a movie about an FBI agent going undercover at a beauty pageant. It has a great romantic subplot, but there is a great movie if that subplot's not there.
Now, the next question, which ties into how the book originated, tell me about the timeline that you choose to go with for this. You start with When Harry Met Sally as the origin of the modern rom-com. Sort of where's the dividing line for you? And I guess that ties into where did the book come from for you?
Yeah, I guess I'll take the where did it come from first, because writing about rom-coms itself was a pretty big decision where I was kind of sitting down and thinking about what kind of feels like cool uncovered ground that I can really dig into on film. I've worked in entertainment journalism for about a decade now, and covered film from a lot of different angles. And I just felt like there are all these great rom-coms, especially in this modern era, that haven't really gotten their critical due yet. There's been some great critics digging into it online, but there hasn't been like a book to me that really sort of crystallized this. And so once I decided I want to dig into rom-coms and get into both, the history of how they were made and the cultural impact that they had, then it was, well, which rom-coms encompass the biggest territory in that? And When Harry Met Sally, I have a little bit of a personal bias towards it because I will confess it is my favorite rom-com.
Which is the question I was going to ask later. You've already checked that one off.
I've spoiled it already. Sorry. And it really imprinted on me at a young age. It's my mom's favorite movie. And I remember watching it. I grew up in kind of outside of St. Paul in Minnesota. And I remember watching it and not really knowing about like New York or that world and kind of going like, oh, this is what being an adult is.
You can say Jews. It's okay. Only because I am neurotic Northeastern Jew. It's all right. But, but I'm kidding.
I didn't even have that frame of reference. I was just like, oh, adults like wear blazers and walk around in parks and have witty conversations and live in apartments in big cities. It really imprinted on me as like a cool way that adults live. But beyond that was kind of my personal end to it. On the critic lens side, it was sort of that movie. It was the big collaboration between Nora Ephron and Rob Reiner, and I think part of why it's so brilliant is it is right on the knife's edge of those two perspectives. Where, I mean, it literally just came out of long conversations that the two of them had about stuff they don't understand about the other gender, and I think the way that they sort of found the perfect balance where both of those characters are equally the protagonist, I think even now rom-coms really struggle with that. And I think the other thing that made it kind of a logical starting point is it is essentially an unacknowledged remake of Annie Hall, but it puts on a big, happy Hollywood ending that is perfect. An amazing, crowd-pleasing Hollywood ending. And I think that really set the tone for what a rom-com was going to be for the next 15, 20 years, and maybe even now, where you can do something fun and witty and smart, and then you can really go for those kind of what we think of now as a classic rom-com trope. And that to me was the formula that really unlocked what made rom-coms successful for the subsequent years.
Yes, one of the neat things that I really enjoyed about the book is you celebrate the genre without gushing over it. I mean, you're still critical within it, and you really explore what's going on in the films themselves and what goes into all of them coming together and what doesn't happen, and the missed opportunities, or we'll say sliding doors as a joke like that. But yeah, that sense of devoting the time to understanding what it's like exploring romance literature as a genre where these things can get ghettoized and turned into, oh, this isn't the subject to really dive into. You should just enjoy them as popcorn, and you really do get it. Those common elements and those things that recur and what changes and how the creators really try and explore this form.
Well, thanks. So, I appreciate that. It was certainly my goal. And you're right that it's kind of a line you have to walk where you don't also want to say these are the best films ever made, because that's a big dramatic statement that I'm not willing to go. But I think on the totality of kind of film history, rom-coms have always been underrated as opposed to overrated. Even when they've been hits, even when they've been successful, even when they've been critically acclaimed, they are still seen as lesser in a way that I thought we're going to begin with the premise that these are great movies worthy of conversation. And even the ones that are not great movies have interesting things to say about Hollywood, about our culture, about the way we date. And that's all worth unpacking.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, too, that it wasn't just the highs that you focus on. Honestly, one of the weird things is going into this, I was thinking, rom-coms, not my genre, not that sort of guy, etc. And then I'd go through it and I realized I've seen 9 of the 15 movies that are your main topics for this, as well as a lot of the ancillary ones on the side. And I realized that's actually a better track record than I had with Brett Martin's Difficult Men book, which I thought was supposed to be right up my alley.
Right.
So, it's kind of amazing how these things, are such integral parts of our culture, I guess. And so what was the pitch like essentially with a publisher in terms of the, trust me, this is a genre we can really get into in a book that's going to be a fascinating exploration.
Yeah, I was lucky when I started because I brought up rom-coms to my agent, who then went to my editor and immediately was like, yes, we understand that. We see what he's talking about. There is a cool story here that we don't think has been told. So they were on board, at least conceptually, with rom-coms. But I think what I needed to narrow down in the pitch, other than figuring out the movies, which was, a really difficult and painful winnowing process. I mean, I probably started with a list of 70 or 80 movies to bring it down to the ones that really get covered in detail. But once I'd done that, and part of the reason I was able to winnow that list down at all was to kind of say, what is the actual arc of this genre? If we're going to cover individual movies, but we're also going to tell a story about how rom-coms evolved over 30 years. And I think that was the part where they really understood what I was saying. There'd been about, 7 years ago at this point, there was kind of this big glut of like death of the rom-com think pieces where it was like studios weren't really making them anymore. There wasn't much really happening in the genre. That's a little bit of a misnomer, but it was certainly the cultural understanding of what had happened to rom-coms in the broader sense. And to be able to say we had this great boom era, we had this sort of strange decline, and now there's really cool stuff happening like in real time. As I was writing the book, I had to keep updating the last couple chapters because new rom-com stuff kept happening. And so to be able to say to my publisher, like, there is a story on top of all of the little stories that really ties this all together, I think they really got what I meant, that rom-coms were interesting to dig into that way.
Yeah, I found it fascinating, again, in terms of that arc and the way you establish it chronologically through these Keystone films. But I have to ask, of course, what was the last one that got cut before you really just had to, God damn it, I really wish I could include this, but
probably the one that still pains me a little bit when I look at the book is all of the teen rom-coms, which I originally had a chapter that was kind of like Clueless and 10 Things I Hate About You, and I think there is a really cool story, and all these great young stars came up through that, and I think those movies are so smart, and there's just a lot of stuff to say about that. And then it was a mix of, this book cannot be more, I mean, it was 430 pages as it is, and I just thought this could easily be 1,000 pages if I put in all the movies I would really like to dig into. And also, Jen Chaney had written this amazing oral history book about Clueless, As If, which is just a whole book just about Clueless. And I looked at that and I went through it and I thought, well, I'm not going to do better than this in a chapter. She got everything. And so if I'm not going to do Clueless, which one is it? And it was probably 10 Things I Hate About You. But at that point, it was just, we're gonna focus on the movies that I've already got locked down. I've got enough here, but it was painful.
Now, what's the film that, as you've already started doing press, what's the movie that people have said, oh, why didn't you have X? Is there one that particularly comes up most often? Because my wife's is Return to Me.
Oh, interesting.
She's like, does it even get mentioned? I'm like, I don't think so. But Music and Lyrics does, which is her other fave in the Drew Barrymore chapter. But yeah, is there one that everybody's like, oh, how could you not include?
Certainly there's people.
Everybody have a different fave.
There's a lot of... with Nora Ephron, it was so hard to make any cuts, especially because when I'm starting with When Harry Met Sally, and I don't want to, in the first chapter, jump ahead like 10 years in her career. So You've Got Mail does not come up as much as I think almost everyone has complained to me that I did, like, because I get into When Harry Met Sally and Sleepless in Seattle, and it's like, it's a trilogy, man. You gotta, but at some point it's like, in my first chapter I would have been in 1998 and past it, and it was just kind of like, I at some point I just got to jump to Pretty Woman.
Yeah, there was also the creepy, problematic thing, which comes up in a number of these things, which we'll talk about.
Oh, yeah.
Further along, definitely.
Not all of these movies have aged perfectly.
No, and that's going to be a question I have. Which ones actually aged better? But we'll get to that soon. But one of my questions sort of is, how much original reporting was there? You mentioned, interviewing some of the players, both actors and producers involved in this. How much was original reporting and how much was, again, research and working with archival?
Yeah, it's
material?
A good question. It's a huge mix. I mean, the first line of defense was always, who can I talk to? And I was a lot of the people were really able to talk, which was great. Some of it was people who like literally weren't around anymore. Like obviously a dream interview would have been Nora Ephron or to talk to Gary Marshall about Pretty
Woman.
Woman.
My next question. Yeah. Who do you wish you could have gotten? Ephron and Marshall already written down.
And so, and part of the reason, just on a practical level, it was good to be covering the modern rom-com is, if I wanted to write about His Girl Friday, which I would love to, like, I'm not getting any interviews for that. There's with a lot of the movies I'm writing about, most of the people who made them were still around. And a lot of those people really were willing to talk. I had great conversations with a lot of the directors, some of the stars. Nia Vardalos was really great and generous with her time. Judy Greer was really great and generous with her time. But it didn't shock me. I tried really hard to get Julie Roberts, and tried every avenue, and she just doesn't want to do press. And I get it. I went through the archives and I read every feature that was written about her and kind of her rom-com boom. And it was a tough beating she took. Like, why would she ever want to talk about this era? So when it came to that, a lot of the dream interviews did come through. The ones that didn't, I found the archives were richer than I would have expected, because these movies were so in the popular consciousness that I was able to kind of these old profiles and kind of half forgotten set reports from, literally digging through old paper copies of Variety and stuff. You'd be like, whoa, I don't think anyone remembers this was reported 20 years ago. And so between those two things, I felt like I got a pretty complete picture.
Understood. And Ephron and Gary Marshall would have been your two lost.
Certainly, they're two
people.
of the big ones. The other one that was a real bummer was Tom Hanks was lined up, and then had a change in his shooting schedule, and that one fell through, and that was a real bummer. I was very excited to talk to him, but I did talk to Rita Wilson, who was amazing and kind of gave me a great perspective on some of the stuff because she was always around when they were making, and they're in Sleepless in Seattle together. So.
And he converted to Greek Orthodox?
He did.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I'd mentioned to my wife, who's my big fat Greek wedding fan also. She's like, I didn't realize the stories paralleled quite as much as they did.
It looked like a cool wedding. I saw pictures.
Oh, really? Wow. Now, one of the neat things, or among the many neat things about the book, or one of the things that you focus on that I found of real interest was the sense of subversion and genre breaking almost from the beginning. Like once the template is established, and when Harry Met Sally is a weird structure for a movie to begin with. But when you get to something like My Best Friend's Wedding, where Julia Roberts' goal was to play the villain, and instead of being the hero, and you're trying to figure out how to be sympathetic towards this person who's trying to break up a marriage. A number of the films you explored do that. They involve tweaking or otherwise, breaking with convention. Is that something that, you found interesting as far as milestones in the form went, or they just happen to be, these really, key moments in the establishment and the arc, I guess, of rom-coms?
I think it's interesting because I think it says multiple things. I think one of the things that frustrated me, especially as I read old reviews of these movies, which are often very sexist and kind of dismissive, is that even when these movies are kind of being goofy and corny, they know what they're doing. They're not doing this accidentally. And I think that self-awareness is part of a good signpost for that these movies are kind of reflexively commenting on themselves. And I'm glad you bring up My Best Friend's Wedding, because to me that was a chapter I was really excited to write, because I think that movie, even though it was this big hit, has never really gotten its due for how risky it was for really everyone making it. I mean, that was a Julia Roberts is terrific in that. And that is a really risky role for her to take on at kind of the height of rom-com stardom, to quite literally invite who might well have been her box office rival to get the guy that she's supposed to get in your conventional rom-com structure, like with Cameron Diaz. I mean, that's a pretty big swing she took. And that was, 5 years after Pretty Woman. It was a pretty major choice in her career.
And you also bring up the issues of casting a Rupert Everett and having him have a normal life. And just, ultimately we get, the gay best friend down the line as a standard trope. But the idea that, someone really had to make that jump and make that casting decision. Yeah.
And for him to just instantly be clearly the most likable and delightful and enjoyable character in the entire movie and just steal every single scene he's in. I mean, that is a really interesting movie, especially for when it came out.
Yeah, and that's among the 6 that I have not seen of the 15 main ones. And that was the first one. I was like, I kind of think I should watch that. That he's making this sound much, much more interesting than I would have thought, and I really need to.
Yeah, I really do recommend it. It's terrific.
Cool. I'll find out where it's streaming, which gets us to the whole thing of, and this will be a much longer conversation, trust me, but streaming and the effect on film, on movies in general, and audience expectations. I found near the very end, or at the very end, when you start exploring Netflix and its, approach to rom-coms and what it's discovering about the audience, where do you see overall, the effect of Netflix, Hulu, et cetera, on not just the rom-coms, but talk about the entire movie industry and entertainment as we know it, Scott.
Hey, that's my bread and butter.
I got you on.
That's another one where when I knew I was going to write that chapter, I was like, I cannot wait to roll up my sleeves and do this, because that is it is such an interesting and complicated thing happening, and they are so non-transparent that that Netflix does not put out their streaming numbers. They will not really talk to you on the record about why they're making the choices they're making. And so in some ways you have to sort of reverse engineer the whole reporting process, where, about 5 years ago, they started putting out a ton of rom-coms. And so you look at that and you go, well, they have more data about what people are watching than anyone at any other point in human history. And so they're seeing something. And then you look at clearly what happened was, they put up Pretty Woman, and 1 million people watched it 6 times in a month, because that's what always happened with rom-coms. It's part of why they were such culturally durable movies, is that people loved revisiting them. And at some point, the development people at Netflix, and they did give one interview to the Hollywood Reporter about this when this was happening that I was able to pull from. But there were literally 2 guys who were just like, they're watching all these archive movies that, these archive rom-coms. Why don't we just make movies in this vein? The studios have abandoned them. Someone must want to write them, direct them, star in them, and we'll just do a bunch of them, and then they'll just be ours. And it's exactly what happened. And it was hugely successful. And the people I was able to get on the record talking about all this were often the writers and directors and the stars of these Netflix movies. And their experience in kind of these, rushed productions, that doesn't mean they're not careful productions, but clearly it is Netflix seeing a gold rush and taking it. And they had just fascinating stories to tell about, rom-com scripts that sat dormant for a decade and then instantly started a bidding war when Netflix started sniffing around. It's just fascinating. It's changing how every movie is made, but I think especially for rom-coms, they realized there was so much money on the table.
I did love the one little aside you had about Crazy Rich Asians, the bidding between those two. Warner Brothers gave them a very good offer and then told them they had 15 minutes to
Isn't that insane? It's like mafioso stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I've been involved in multi-billion-dollar negotiate, again, weird day job stuff.
Right.
And even that, there's been, we'll talk to you tomorrow. There's always an overnight time for cooling off. So yes, I found 15 minutes a little
you kind of have to love it. I mean, it's a story in itself. I mean, that's the story of making the movie should be a movie.
You also have a great one of that with Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher in relation to another one of the movies that I did not see, which you did not make sound more interesting than it should be.
Yeah.
The Friends with Benefits era. But actually keeping with the arc of the whole book, and we're jumping all over the place in that arc and may come sliding off of it, how romance has changed in the real world and how that's reflected in rom-coms. Do you see the movies being any sort of significant indicator of where things have been going, or are they always sort of, tracking things a few years distant and through the perspective of studio heads and things of that ilk?
Yeah, I think like all things, Hollywood is trying to be on the cutting edge and not doing a great job of being there. The chapter you talk about with Friends with Benefits and No Strings Attached, which came out more or less simultaneously, was part of this really kind of funny boom of Hollywood being like, how are the kids dating these days? Oh, they're having casual hookups before they even kiss and fall in love. Like, why don't we make a movie about that? And it was, I think, a well-intentioned effort to sort of update a rom-com trope for the audience that they really wanted, which was 20-somethings. But in practice, those were just conventional rom-coms with like a minor tweak to the structure where they hook up, and then inevitably the ending of both those movies is they actually do want a traditional monogamous relationship. And so and so it's not really digging into, I mean, I would love it if someone really earnestly, certainly if one of the studios made like an open relationship rom-com and did it, like really did it. Didn't pretend they were doing it and then find a way to like shoehorn the traditional tropes in.
Because it has to be true love and the chasing down at the airport or the bridge or wherever the climactic moment is.
And I get the tension of like those rom-com tropes are extremely satisfying. There's a reason that people, most rom-coms go back to them. Audiences love them when they're well executed, and as well they should. They're great. But I do think a really good filmmaker could have it both ways. I think you can tell a romantic story that is not about such a traditional relationship. And maybe there are baby steps in that direction. At the very least, there is more diversity in the genre now than there's ever been. And I don't want to give them a gold star for that because that is so long overdue, but it is at least a sign that the things might be improving, not where they should be, but better than they've been.
Keeping my fingers crossed for Billy Eichner next year
this year. I hope that's good. I'm so excited to see that movie. Even just a frame, a trailer. I can't wait.
Right. Now, but one of the interesting things to me when you talk about the self-awareness of genre and the conscious decision to break with traditions, something that happens and I'm sure you're aware of it in almost every art form and genre. Self-awareness turns into self-consciousness, and you get exactly what you're talking about, that sort of embarrassment about being in a rom-com, but we're going to try and have our cake and eat it too. It's a weird thing how, postmodernism and deconstruction teaches us to, look for all of these standard tropes and try to circumvent them. And yet, we keep either creating unsatisfying art that seems, half-assed, or what I wonder about is, with rom-coms in particular, do you find that they've sort of come out the other side through either that diversity or a sense of earnestness again, like a return to the idea of, let's make a romantic comedy. We'll have some of the self-aware tropes to it, but we're not going to try and blow up the entire genre anymore. Let's take it into Crazy Rich Asians territory and bring in the culture instead of, this idea of subverting what a rom-com is ultimately.
Yeah, I think at its best, that's definitely happening. And like most things, I think the bellwether for it is streaming, because that's a faster moving world than the studios are these big kind of ocean liners trying to turn, and they're doing it pretty slowly. Whereas streaming can be a little more versatile and respond a little faster. The earliest indicator for like straight ahead rom-coms work is what Hallmark is doing. That Hallmark now has like 5 months a year where it's just all Christmas rom-coms, and they are extremely tropey. They are not apologetic about it. They do not wink. They go straight down the middle of the plate, and the appetite is apparently insatiable. I think there are smarter versions of that being done elsewhere. It's, to me, what's really hardening is when I look at something like I loved Palm Springs on Hulu last year.
Oh God!
My God! Brilliant movie. And it was just like a weird sci-fi time loop rom-com that is doing all of those things and doing it really well. It is not embarrassed about being a rom-com, but it is also doing more stuff than you would expect if you said, hey, there's a new rom-com on Hulu. That does not really prepare you for the movie you're about to get into. No. But I think that movie, that was a huge streaming hit for them. If it wasn't their biggest of the year, it was Happiest Season, but it was one of the two, which another rom-com, and another rom-com, that one about a relationship between two women. So I like to look at the streamers and say, there is creative work happening here. That is not running away from rom-com tropes. It's just kind of adding to them.
Do you find, though, those tend to be in that, we'll say, low budget mode, where it's less about movie stars and more about, let's make a Hallmark?
Yeah, that's
movie?
Certainly part of it. And those movies don't have no budget. You've got, you've got actors, and but at the same time, it's, if you want to look at what's happening at the studios, this year, the two that I really have my eye on, one in just a week or two, is "Marry Me" with J-Lo and Owen Wilson, which is a very kind of classic, almost like a late 2000s style rom-com, where it's very kind of contrived, and she's supposed to be marrying a guy on stage at her biggest concert. She's like a giant pop star, like J-Lo, and then the guy drops her, and she just marries a guy who has a "Marry Me" sign in the crowd. That is that's Owen Wilson. And just apparently, I haven't seen the film yet, but just apparently just in this moment of crisis when she gets dumped, that is the kind of and I really don't mean this as a criticism, but that's kind of like how aliens think human beings act. That is a crazy reaction to what is undeniably a pretty stressful moment for that character. But I like that rom-coms can do that, and I think the good ones do that, and then make it feel human and fun, and are being kind of arch about the whole thing.
Well, you do quote Mindy Kaling in the book with her line that rom-coms are actually a subset of sci-fi.
Right.
That they operate in a different world, and once you understand and accept the logic of that world, then you can fully embrace it.
Yeah, which I think is very astute, and it's part of why I get so annoyed when I read the old reviews where people kind of grumble about it being unrealistic, and it's like, yeah, this is the same era of Schwarzenegger and Stallone, and people didn't talk a lot of shit on guys indulging in these action movies. It's okay. Escapism it's not stupid. It's not, the audience is aware that they're escaping, and that is the joy of it.
Yeah. Now, A, how is COVID era rom-com faring? And B, are there ones that you just have really returned to again and again in the last 2 years as part of the lockdown?
Oh, for sure.
Sort of world?
Other than the ones I covered in the book, which of course I had to revisit 8,000 times a piece. I can recite most of them from memory at this point. I would say I like most films, I am not finding the stuff that's being made during COVID super successful. Certainly not the stuff about COVID. I was kind of hopeful about Locked Down. Came out on HBO Max, the kind of heist rom-com with Anne Hathaway and Chiwetel Ejiofor. Which is literally about kind of we can do a robbery because COVID's happening. And they're this couple who are breaking up because they're stuck together because of lockdown. And I think to do a rom-com about COVID, to me, is we're a little too close to it still. That's not the escapism I'm looking for in a rom-com, even if you do it in a frothy, funny way. But I have found that in terms of movies that I've really enjoyed visiting, I pounded through the Netflix rom-com cinematic universe, and I found it so delightful and so weird.
Do you really think it's all going to tie together? Do you really feel like they're going to bring it in?
That's what's amazing. It's, people always talk about Marvel, and sometimes they talk about all the Conjuring movies, but like there's this third cinematic universe that is like very quietly unfolding on Netflix, where the Christmas Prince showed up for the coronation of the princess switch, and then in A Castle for Christmas, some of these other characters showed up in Scotland, and like it's all building to something. It's clearly all these movies are shooting in Romania at roughly the same time, probably with the same crew, and they're going like, yeah, whatever, let's bring Vanessa Hudgens in here for 3 hours. but I found those movies just purely delightful, and I just absolutely pounded them over the holidays.
Is it your favorite genre in general? You've written about a whole lot of other forms.
Yeah, it's hard to pick a favorite. It's certainly probably the one that, like, if I'm ready to, if it's like a Friday after a work week, it is probably the one that I am most eager to pull up the queue and be like, oh, what rom-coms did they add to Hulu this week? I need to, other stuff I love, but I kind of need to amp myself up for a little more. There was never a time when I'm not in the mood for a good rom-com.
Which, again, may be why I've seen, I think, 60% of the ones that you covered here. I'm like,
absolutely.
Yeah, it turns out they are really good comfort movies. The thing with music and lyrics, which I had to explain to my wife, only comes up in the Drew Barrymore chapter that you did. Back when I used to travel for work in the before time, pretty much any time I was away, when I came back in the recently played thing on Netflix, it would be music and lyrics. Just watch it every time I was gone.
And please apologize to your wife for me that it is not covered in more detail. That is, for the record, a movie I adore. It was just one where because I had done 4 weddings and a funeral, and I was doing Love Actually, I just thought, I can't make this book about Hugh Grant. He cannot be the only actor that I cover here. So at some point it was a hard cut, but I think that is a terrific rom-com.
Oh, in my best looking days about 20 years ago, I was About a Boy, Hugh Grant.
Oh, wow.
On two different occasions in a week. And I thought, it's not going to get any better than this. I've actually got that look down. And since then it's all been downhill.
Yeah, but, that's a pretty high peak, though. I would embrace that.
Yeah, I'll take that over, a very English Scandal, Hugh Grant, which is probably where I'm headed ultimately. But still, we'll see. But let's get to that question, though, of rom-coms that that are more problematic as the years go by. Are there ones that you have I can't watch this anymore?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I guess can't watch this is a little overstating it, because it's more stuff I don't like to watch. And it's.
Do you have kids? Is there anything you wouldn't show? Like, okay, kids, you're not going to understand why we liked this back then, because this is so wrong now.
Yeah, I have a 5-month-old daughter, so she's not really following the movies I'm watching yet.
Good. Okay.
But certainly there'll be stuff where at the very least we would sit down and have a conversation. It's kind of on two things, where they're the ones that I just don't think have aged well. Like at its time, I was like, Wedding Crashers is hilarious. And then I revisited it and I was like, I don't like this. I don't like that this is a movie where I'm supposed to sympathize with these gross guys who are like crashing people's weddings and getting women drunk and sleeping with them. That to me is not a good starting premise for a rom-com. And part of what was interesting about writing this book is to go back to movies that I had seen and then not revisit it and go, wow, I've changed a lot since the last time I saw this. And this was stuff that really should have troubled me more than it did. But in terms,
are there ones that have gotten better for you?
Yeah, I think so.
And some of that you can also attribute to aging into, when I was 20 something.
Right.
I didn't understand what it means to lose something or whatever.
Yes, when your own relationships get a little richer, the movies get richer.
Plus, you get the Nancy Myers age. I'm at 51, so I'm headed into that age group now.
Well, I've always related to Nancy Myers. I love her movies. But yeah, in terms of ones that I liked more, My Best Friend's Wedding is certainly one that I was like, I remembered liking it, and then when I revisited it, thinking about it for the book, I was like, whoa, this is much more subversive than I remembered. I remember sort of rolling my eyes a little bit at How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days when it came out. Just being like, oh yeah, this is kind of like, like zingy and frothy and, not really that great. And then when I revisited it, it was like, yeah, of course, they're doing a tribute to like the Rock Hudson Doris Day stuff. Like it is a very stylish movie on purpose. It is very contrived on purpose. And so that was a movie that I hadn't really given its due till I was considering it for this book.
And thank you for doing that one instead of the Renee Zellweger, Ewan McGregor.
Oh, Down with Love.
Down with Love. Yeah. Which, oh my God. Oh, I shouldn't make in case
I like
it's something you like.
Yeah.
See,
hey, you don't need to agree with me on every movie, but I think that was fun. That one is very stylized, but
yeah, I was hoping for more style, frankly.
Yeah.
Something that really just pays absolute, homage to that era.
Right.
But yeah, it's we've all got our things, and some movies we just hit on at the wrong time, either wrong time in our lives or just a bad day.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, we'll sit down and I didn't dig this. This is terrible. You see it 6 months later. It's, oh my God, what did I not get?
There's nothing I love better than being wrong about a movie in a good way. When a movie is better than I thought it was, that is so delightful.
Now, tell me, this is also your first book. The joy at seeing a book with your name on it, getting the box of copies, not the review copies, but the actual hardcovers.
Yeah.
Have you had that thrill?
Yes.
And okay.
That was a cool moment. It was certainly one of those things that you imagine that a lot of times. At least I did. I always liked writing. I always, in my wildest dreams as a kid, thought about writing books. And to just have the box show up and realize that was the box, and to have that moment where you take a breath and I put my phone away. I kind of sat there and looked at the box for a while. Then I opened the book, and then for me, at least, opening the book was a really funny thing, because on one level, it was like the coolest, craziest feeling of like, this is a book with my name on it and it's going to be in stores. And then on another level, I paged through and it's like, yeah, I know. Like I wrote all of this. I've been through like 15 rounds of edits. Like there's nothing that I will get out of opening this book. I've signed off on this PDF like 10 times.
There's one thing that every author experiences: the typo. There will be that moment where you find something like, mother, how did that get in?
I have not found it yet. I'm sure when the book comes out, the tweets are coming and I will be crushed. But so far, so good. So far, I don't know anything.
Good. Don't open it again.
Agreed.
Just let it sit.
Yep.
But tell me about your writing background and your sort of literary upbringing.
Yeah.
How did you end up doing what you do?
It was certainly not a planned road. I'm obviously very happy that's the road I ended up on. But I actually studied English and screenwriting in college. Had no thoughts of entertainment journalism, which is what I ended up making my career in. And I only ended up getting any journalism experience at all because my senior year of college, I studied abroad, and part of that came with doing an internship. And they could not find an internship for me in film. I was in London, and they just, for whatever reason, none of the British production companies needed anybody. And so they kind of came to me and said, well, sorry, the best we can do is get you journalism. And it was doing finance journalism. It was like a paid subscription blog for wealth managers. And it's something I absolutely knew nothing about. But it turned out I didn't need to know anything, because all I was doing was, as quickly as possible, reporting, this person got hired by this bank, or this bank merged with this bank, or this bank did this deal. Yeah. And, for those 6 months, I wrote, I don't know, a couple hundred very quick articles. And so when I came back, I had this stack of professional journalism things. And I, more or less on a whim, after I graduated, applied to a fellowship at the Atlantic. Just kind of hoping that, they might be looking for someone with some blogging skills. And it was right around the time the Atlantic was really ramping up their digital side. And so I think the fact that I had so much copy just kind of appealed to the people who were making the selections. And so
you can make words.
Yeah. Exactly. and more importantly, make them quickly, because it was clear that, I hadn't had endless amounts of time to turn around this blog copy. And so I was in LA at the time. I moved to Washington, D.C. and started this fellowship. And very quickly, I was like, what I always liked was culture, film and TV and literature. And so I just kind of did my best to get to know the culture editor on the web there, and just say, anytime you want anyone to write something but you don't know who, let me take a shot at it. If you don't like it, no problem. I'll do it on my own time. And eventually that worked. And that kind of gave me my inroad to doing culture criticism.
Did it involve changing gears, essentially?
A little bit.
In terms of writing? I used to be business to business magazine editor. So I was, from post-grad school onwards, was always writing about, taking the adjectives out of press releases was the first thing.
Totally.
Yeah. That was always our writing test with people. Just rewrite this. So take the adjectives out. And
the official duties of my fellowship were for the print magazine. And so I was doing a lot of fact checking, researching for upcoming features, that sort of thing, which, again, hugely, I used that stuff for the book. Quite a bit. So that was a great education. But the writing I wanted to do was not a part of my fellowship. That was just something I had to strongly put myself forward for until I broke through.
Hmm. And never look back, essentially, once you were able to get into the entertainment space?
Yeah, I just loved doing it. And it was nice because I, like many people who graduate, I think, with a degree in English and or screenwriting or any other film degree, it's kind of like, I love this stuff. I don't quite know what the real practical application in the real world is. I don't know who will hire me to do something with it. And when it was a combination of something I always loved, which was writing, which was an expertise I had, and I quickly found that the stuff that I'd learned in film school was actually hugely helpful to being a good critic. Even though that was not how I had been trained. It was a different way to watch the stuff that I was writing about. A lot of the first stuff I did was TV recaps. This was a real golden era where Alan Sepinwall had kind of set the tone, and Emily Vanderwerf had done this great stuff at the AV Club and built this great stable there. And so I was really inspired by the depth and breadth, and of course the TV shows were really meriting it. And I found that I was, if I can say something nice about myself, I found that I was able to write stuff about the shows that I didn't see other critics doing, because I think a lot of them were TV enthusiasts who didn't have a formal background. And that is not to say they weren't writing great stuff. It just meant that I was able to do something a little different. And I think that helped a lot.
It puts me in mind of, and again, not to draw comparisons, recording with David Thompson a couple of weeks ago and talking about even when he was a little kid, they go out to the movies and all of his friends would be, they'd be moved by the movie, and he would be sitting there like, how did it make me feel like that? Mm-hmm. And start trying to figure out what was in the story and the whole way it was filmed and everything else. So yeah, he said even as a little kid, he was always breaking films down in some way or another.
I love that. And I totally get it. Like I like, there's some people who are kind of like, once you've had the education in this, you feel like you can't enjoy film the same way. And I just find it becomes more enjoyable. Like it's fun to unpack it like the puzzle box, and and I still cry at movies constantly. Like the baseline emotional stuff completely works on me. I am a total sap, but to also kind of say, okay, now I'm going to take apart the engine. Like that's a different pleasurable experience.
Any risk of, I don't want to say access journalism, but at least, people you really love sitting down and recording or interviewing, and their new thing is just, let me just, he was ably backed by, the band. To throw in another movie you don't actually get to in the book, but I understand because Singles is such a weird movie all around.
Another movie that I really like, it's certainly of its era. I mean, you want to talk a movie in a place and time. Oh
God, I was 21 or 22 in college. Oh, that was
so that was your North Star. I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah, other people love reality bites and things like that, like a year or two later. But I'm like, it's weird when generation gaps come down to like a 6-month span.
Yeah,
they really do in that case.
No, and reality bites has never been my favorite. I'll go on the record here, but I think Singles is delightful.
Yeah, I also have the counterintuitive notion that William Hurt is actually the only good character in broadcast news, but that's a separate thing we could talk about some other time. But it's only in watching it now and realizing he's the only person who's honest about what he's trying to do.
It's interesting.
But anyway, he's honest about using using the same camera and all that. Right. But anyway, so yeah, the access thing, or the becoming friends, or at least liking certain people that you have to write about.
It's always it's as simple as kind of reminding yourself that your duty is, to your readers and through your editor. And a good editor will, of course, get you on track if you're being a little kind to a subject. For me, the experience is very different. I write profiles too. I've done especially for GQ, I've done a good chunk of profiles. And I find that those don't require you necessarily to have a strong critical opinion about the work. Whether or not you do, that doesn't necessarily enter into the writing process. It's almost like you did that work in advance, because if you're profiling someone, there is something you find interesting about them. And for me, more often than not, it's not because I loved the movie they were in. It's because there's some other thing tied to the fact that they made that movie that's interesting.
Do those tend to be assigned, or is it something you also partially pitch?
I pitch more often than it's assigned. I've had it happen both ways, but I'm fortunate enough that I have a good relationship with my editors, and so they also kind of know what I'm interested in, and so often it's not surprising what one or the other of us will come up with. I find that works
along those
well.
lines. Beyond rom-com, what are you interested in?
Well, certainly, culture writ large. This book happens to be about film. I follow and work in, write about television just as closely. I've done a fair amount of video games criticism, partially because, much like I ended up working and, writing a book about rom-coms, it feels like there's a lot of kind of uncovered ground there. where that's a medium that, because it's a little newer, because it was an enthusiast medium for a long time, and because we're kind of now in probably the second generation of critics who grew up with games. I feel like there's still more to say, kind of establishing the baseline of what video game criticism even looks like. So that's me in the culture space. But I also, I like going on hikes. I like walking around with my wife and daughter and dog.
I will say I've avoided video games only because, being raised with pinball and then cabinet video games, etc. I realize how obsessive and how life destroying they would be for me.
Yeah, I'm just certainly a fine line there. But I mean, pinball too. I'm a huge analog pinball guy, so I've got a pinball bar near my place that I frequent.
Adam's Family, number one.
Oh, so good.
All time.
That's an amazing machine. Yeah. I'm
My
a
brother
Twilight
and
Zone
I,
guy, but it's close.
Twilight Zone is great.
So
and
good.
especially because you get the golden earring version of Twilight Zone at the end with the soundtrack. I haven't played it in a million years.
You remember it well.
Oh, God. Again, this is I could have cured cancer, but instead comic books and pinball machines are just filling up all my brain.
Who wrote that song about you?
Right. Oh, it's terrible. But yeah, it's that sense of the things what we enjoy and how we enjoy it and what it says about us is something I've been interested in for a bazillion years.
Yeah.
So, seeing something like this where you're really approaching, again, a form that I'd like to think we're past the age of guilty pleasures where people have to excuse liking certain things. I still did not tell David Thompson that Hudson Hawk is one of my favorite stupid movies, but
I don't think that's a stupid movie. I think that's a smart movie.
It's a tough one to justify sometimes. Even when it came out and I'd seen it 3 times in the theater, people were like, how can you see that? It was the biggest bomb and this, that, and the other. I was like, no, I didn't spend $60 million on it. I spent $6 a pop. That was pretty much it.
No, that's one of the things. It's so fascinating to me that box office grosses have trickled down to like casual conversation, because it's like, what do you care, man? Like, what does it matter if that Marvel movie made $1 billion? Guess what? They're going to keep making them. You're doing just fine.
But this one was only $650 million. It's a real downer, and it's like, but
unless you have an investment or report on the industry, it's not really your problem.
Yeah, and that's certainly a question though, like how Hollywood became, the meta story of movies. Mm-hmm. We'd always had gossip columns. There's always been the fabricated as well as the real stories of the actors and studios and such. But that sense where, and it's something you explore, some of the stories behind the films themselves. When did that become, that because you're clearly pulling from archive stories about some of this stuff. When did that really become the story itself, I guess, what went into making a movie?
Well, I think it's more recent than the start of the book. The trades were always there, but they really were interesting to people who worked in the business. There wasn't this sense of, the way that now Variety and Hollywood Reporter and all those places their bread and butter really was reporting. And now there's lots of, criticism and, these kind of glossy features and that sort of thing. I think it's part of enthusiast culture and fandom and stuff has really taken over the entertainment industry. And the entertainment industry has been very canny in sort of weaponizing that, and turning those fans into acolytes and letting those acolytes kind of drown out legitimate journalism and legitimate criticism, or at least, kind of bringing them in and giving them very little in return, except for more of the stuff that they already like. And I think that's kind of part and parcel with what you're talking about, where those people, the fans who really get into stuff are interested in every part of it. And, on a baseline, I think that's cool. Like I may joke about the box office earnings, but like the business is interesting. There's a reason that I work in it. There's really interesting stuff, and following the economics of it are interesting because that leads to the creative, and that affects if you're a fan. I wish there's a little less of interest in the business side and a little more in the product. And I feel like that balance is off, and I don't know how you unring that bell now that this stuff is, even published widely on every major fan blog, what the box office grosses are every weekend and box office analysis. It's like fantasy football. It's all gotten a little gamified.
Yeah. To me, that's been the death of, I won't say the death of rom-coms, the death of culture in general is just this sense of quantification and this need to constantly be, measuring and grading against X, Y, and Z.
Exactly.
Yeah. That said, my biggest thing, and we'll get into the problematicness of Joss Whedon. I've only seen a couple of seasons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer many years ago with my wife. For me, the all-time greatest episode was one where one of the supporting characters is the lead and everyone else is just in the background having world-saving adventures, but he's got to figure out how to like stop some zombie invasion or something. So that when you brought up in a chapter about Judy Greer, the idea of her and Catherine Hahn doing the exact same thing, being the sidekick best friends in a movie while like Kate Hudson is swanning around in the background having some great adventure that you never really learn about. To me, that's absolutely what I would go see. And I realize nobody else in the world wants to go see that, but it was so nice to see Catherine Hahn, just push out some idea like that. I'm like, well, you're clearly channeling me on this one.
I think someone else would want to see it. We're in a renaissance right now. Like if she's going to make that movie, now is the moment. I'm sure Judy Greer's still down.
Oh, and Judy Greer is one of the few celebrities I'll follow on Instagram just because of the sheer goofiness and, willingness to, I know it's all creation and stage, et cetera, but it's something about the persona I've always adored.
I'm happy to say she could not be cooler. I rarely talk about the people I interview in like a person to person level, but I will say like everything you would dream of. If you've watched a Judy Greer rom-com and been like, oh, I wish she was my best friend. Like me too. I talked to her for a while. She's the coolest.
Yeah, I heard her on Maron once and just thought she projects authenticness. However, you want to say, and it could all be actors and whatever, but there was a sense
I don't think so. I think she's actually that cool.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of fun. I was disappointed the one time she got a lead in a sitcom. Of course, it didn't survive.
Oh, yeah, Married?
Misguided. No, Married, she barely got on screen with that Nat Faxon guy taking up all the time, which also I have issues about, but that's neither here nor there.
Sure.
But yeah, she had a show called Misguided where she was a guidance counselor.
I remember that. That's good.
And went away after like 6 episodes or something.
Of course.
I was like, because Judy Greer should be the lead.
Yep.
But anyway, as far as immersion in entertainment culture goes, you owned John Wick's trunk. And you wrote a piece about how incredibly difficult it was to move when you were living in Brooklyn, which raises the question, did it make the trip with you to L.A. or have you subsequently
I am so delighted this came up. Yes, the trunk survived. That was a whole different process that I did not write an article about because I flew. We shipped all our stuff to L.A., but I could not figure out how to get it here. It was terrible. And I called a FedEx station. I should tell for people listening to this, it's the trunk from the movie John Wick, where he buries all of his guns and gold and stuff. And someone was just giving it away on Craigslist. And I happened to be the first person to respond and get it. And so it's this, but it is massive. If you've seen the movie, it is bigger than you'd think, and it looks pretty big in the movie.
I'll put a picture of it in the show notes for this episode, just from the article, so people will get an idea.
So when I called the FedEx thing, I'd measured it and everything. They're like, yeah, we can do it. And so I had to haul it in an Uber XL to this FedEx place that said they could handle it. And I brought it, and the person at the counter was like, no, we can't take that. And so then I'm stuck in the middle of, I'm in the middle of Brooklyn with this giant trunk. It's just me and one other guy moving it. It's a brutally hot summer day. And so we just took it to the next place we found. We called them and they said the same thing. Yeah, sure. And they again underestimated how big it was. And so they had to cut up their biggest boxes, tape it around this trunk, and then, put a million stamps on it and just kind of hope for the best. And it was certainly expensive to ship, but, and I was convinced it was just going to show up completely destroyed, but showed up at my door and it was in reasonably good condition. The FedEx person was obviously then like, what is this? And so I explained it. He turned out to be a huge John Wick fan. So I unwrapped it so he could take a picture with it for his buddies. But it survived. It remains in my living room. And people, I would say once a month or so, I still get a message from someone trying to buy it.
And did it show up again in John Wick's 2 or 3, or has he already taken all the guns out? And
I was shocked because when I wrote that article, in the back of my mind, I was like, I bet they're going to make another movie and ask if they could borrow this trunk there's somebody's going to figure this out. But they just manufactured a new one. So there are at least 2 of them out there. I forget if it's in part 2 or 3, but the trunk shows up in another one of them. And I was shocked.
Presumably he could drop it on somebody because, you got to come up with interesting ways to kill people from movie to movie.
They've done 3 already. They got to keep digging. Keanu, I know you're listening. Call me. You can borrow the trunk anytime.
Or just come by and sign it for you, and that way you can,
That's a reasonable payment. I think that's a win-win.
Cementing himself as, again, coolest of his age ever. I think we still put Bill Murray at the top for coolest guy.
That's
in
fair.
This or Goldblum. Speaking of, you put a tall guy reference in the book. I thank you, because that's my sneaky super favorite film, at least from my crazy teenage years onwards. The Jeff Goldblum, Rowan Atkinson, Emma Thompson.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a weirdly forgotten movie, especially because it was kickoff for Richard Curtis. You'd think that would have kind of been revisited, but I feel like that one doesn't quite have its cultural place.
You can't even find it on video.
It's crazy, right?
I got it on DVD once, and I ripped it, but I got it from Netflix on DVD back when they did that. But I only ripped it a lower res, and I'm trying to get it again. No way.
I bet that gets like a Blu-ray printing at some. That feels like a movie that someone would go, someone will buy this.
I waited long enough with Miller's Crossing before it finally got its due.
Wow, that took a long time? That's crazy.
That took years to come out on DVD at all.
I had the DVD because I had that Coen Brothers set. I still have it somewhere.
Yeah, I'm saying from the 90s into
totally.
the aughts, it took a bit. Now it's coming out on Criterion.
Oh, that's great news. I hadn't heard that.
In a week or so. In fact, I was supposed to record with one of the guys who contributed a piece for it, but there's only so many people I can catch up with at any one time. But
well, thanks for choosing me.
Yeah. And again, once I saw the tall guy thing, I'm like, this is my guy. He managed to squeeze in one of my all-time favorite movies. So
that one was just for you, Gil. I should have put that in the acknowledgments.
Is there any, I know it's just coming out now in hardcover.
Yep.
Any thoughts of paperback version and anything you would add?
Yeah, that's all stuff we've talked about. It would be interesting. Basically, I mean, the real tale I would need to put on it is, and this literally happened up till I kind of finally had to lock the copy, but there is so much cool stuff happening in rom-coms right now, and it drives me a little crazy that I didn't really get to cover what Billy Eichner's doing, that I won't get to write about Marry Me, or the Sandra Bullock, Channing Tatum kind of Romancing the Stone remake that's coming out over the summer, this unacknowledged riff on that. There's what the studios are doing, or even what happened streaming just over the holidays. The book was already locked by then. And so the big thing I would do is probably add another concluding chapter, basically saying what's happened since the book was published. But other than that, I mean, there's no shortage of interest on my part for going deep on this stuff. So I would welcome the chance to do more.
Any film that your wife said, Scott, you don't have to watch this one more time. You can, you've watched it often enough. Let's move on to the next chapter. Was there anything that really drove her nuts in the process? She's not a fan of Best Friend's Wedding. It's a big debate between us because, as I just told you, I think it's great. So when I revisited that one, she was excited to watch with me and was like, well, next time you watch this one, I don't need to be around. But her beef was much more with stuff that was not in there. Like she loves Never Been Kissed, and was like, oh, you didn't do a whole chapter on that? And it was just, there were my wife asked about that one too. She's
I get it.
Yeah, did he bring it up and the sort of problematic coach thing? I'm like, yeah, it doesn't come up, but I'm sure he's thought about it.
Problematic. I would call that hugely problematic.
Yeah.
but it is. I mean, it is still like, God, what a fun, crowd pleasing movie. It's what rom-coms can do.
Yeah. Who do you feel should have been bigger? Is there someone whose career you really feel like?
Oh, that's a good question.
Is it just bad choices, or they didn't market things right, or
it's certainly easier to identify people who are more recent, people who I don't think have quite had their due yet. There's an essay in the book about how I think Katherine Heigl was treated very unfairly. After
you changed my mind on her, because I fell into the reflexive everything you wrote about in terms of how poorly she was treated. I just fell right into that. Reading your chapter, that really no, that was really unfair. And
I think that was happening in the culture. I think a lot, there was something about her that really bugged people. And I think it was completely divorced from the reality of who she was, the films she was making. So I think I think she's doing just fine. It's not like she needs me to champion the great Katherine Heigl comeback. She's got Firefly Lane on Netflix. She's starring, producing. She's doing just fine. But I would like it if there was a more of a cultural kindness to her, because I think she got a really raw deal after Knocked Up.
It reminds me a little of our retrospective take on Monica Lewinsky and how easy it was to make jokes about this person back then, and she's a human being who has another 60 or 70 years to live. Right. And maybe, we don't need to leave her in this boat.
Just this kind of reflexiveness that, of course, always just seems to be applied to young women. It's weird how that always happens, but I would like to see people be a little more careful about that. And I think there's improvement on that front. Again, we're not where we should be, but I don't see the kind of reflexive Katherine Heigl sucks stuff that you would have, that would have accompanied anything you wrote about Knocked Up even 5-10 years ago.
Sure. And when you talk about younger performers who you think are either should be bigger than they are, or, somebody you're really waiting to see explode?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of great stuff happening. I'm very, very excited about the rise of Henry Golding, who I think is just amazing. I think what a find and what a crazy story that he, literally he was this guy hosting travel shows and then an accountant on Crazy Rich Asians. It's like, oh, here's this handsome guy. Why don't we try him? And I just find him so charming and fun. I love Lana Condor, who came out of the To All the Boys trilogy. I'm curious to see what she does next, because I thought she was really great on this sci-fi show called Deadly Class, in a totally different role than To All the Boys, and the show just didn't take. But I think Lana Condor has a ton of talent, and it will find the right role that shows a different side of her, because that Lara Jean in the To All the Boys movies is a very specific kind of character. And I think she can do more than she did in those movies. So I'm really hoping that to see her in something else great, even a rom-com, but a rom-com with a different tone. Sure. I think she'd be terrific.
And I guess as an easy last question, when we talk about, again, how Katherine Heigl was treated and other issues around this stuff, what did the book teach you about gender, about, ethnicity? You've got a great Will Smith anecdote in there about how they wouldn't cast him with a white love interest in Hitch. Was there a degree to which patterns started to come out for you in ways you hadn't thought about?
Yeah,
previously?
I think when you look at the whole history of the genre, it's one of those things that's depressing because it's a little unsurprising. I think at least there's at least an understanding at this point that things have just been really screwed up in Hollywood for a really long time, and it was never okay, and it lasted and lasts really more. It's much more recent than anyone could possibly justify. But I think it's part of why I tried to write a book that was very fair and honest about the failings of this genre, but there is, I hope, a bit of a celebratory tone, because I think these movies got so unfairly dinged for so long, and I think it was because they were made often by women, targeted mostly at women, and more often than not, frankly, dinged by critics like me. A white dude writing about film and TV, and just kind of being snarky and smarmy, and to start with the premise of like, these are well-made movies that have an important place in history. Honestly, it really, that felt like a privilege to me to be trusted to kind of tell these stories. And I hope I did them justice.
No, you did a fantastic job in the book. The only other question, my wife just texted me about Time, that Domhnall Gleeson, Rachel McAdams movie.
Why it's not in there?
Yeah, I think you mentioned it once. Is it Richard Curtis?
Yeah, it's Richard Curtis.
It comes up in the second Richard Curtis. I'm going to write a
sequel just for your wife. It's official. It's happening. but I will say that one was definitely on the long list, and it was one of those where I just went, I've got Richard Curtis in here. I've got Four Weddings. Yeah. I've got Bridget Jones, and I've got Love Actually. And at some point, I've covered my man Richard Curtis. Like I know, I cannot write a book about Richard Curtis. I have to move on. But I love About Time. I actually think that's probably my favorite of his films. So
yeah, I'm a huge Bill Nye mark also. So yeah, that's yeah. I when she texted it, I'm like, yeah, I should ask. But
I will take the criticism on the chin. I totally get it.
No worries. You weren't doing an encyclopedia. Yeah. You were doing a history in a sense. But real last question: who are you reading?
Oh, wow. Great question.
People hate when I ambush them with that because they can't think of anybody and they feel dumb.
No, I'm always reading a few things at the same time. So I tend to pick up a fiction, nonfiction, and a comic book. So right now I'm reading Hideo Kojima, who's a video game developer who probably most famous for the Metal Gear Solid series. He put out an essay collection of basically his favorite things, where it's all of the art that he thinks made him himself. So it's a lot of essays about very eclectic, where it's, here's a movie he loved as a kid. Here's a book he read as an adult. Here's he wrote about a novelization of one of his own games and how it changed the way he thinks about his work. And so he wrote sort of an interesting sort of, complicated, book about that. For comics, I'm finishing a run on Immortal Hulk, which is amazing. This really weird kind of horror take on the Incredible Hulk. That I would, even if you're not normally a superhero comics person, as I'm always looking for a horror comic personally. And that's one I found really delightful. And for fiction, I just finished my reread of Dune for the first time since middle school. Which, what a fascinating book to revisit many years later in my life, because I loved Dune and I really immersed myself in that world. And then I picked up the sequel in middle school and I went, never again. I don't care for this. This was one book to me. And I loved rereading Dune. And now I'm debating whether I should pick up the sequel again.
It's weird. I never read it growing up. I was an Asimov guy.
Yep.
And then Hitchhiker's Guide hit me when I was like 11 years old, and that kind of took me in a very, very different direction with science fiction. But, for some reason, I always thought the split was between Asimov and Heinlein.
Sure.
But, I never knew if Frank Herbert was, an in-between or a bridge between the two, or if, falls in one camp or the other. But I guess as a 51-year-old, I got to try to take that one up.
Well, I can tell you about one of his books because I could not get further.
Well, again, there's more movies out there. Not a rom-com, but, there is a Dune out there now.
Yep.
So
a movie I liked a lot.
Yeah. Best of luck with launching the book. I kind of hope we can have further conversation about this stuff down the line, whether it's going to be, around a sequel to this. Oh, actually, I guess, do you have another book idea out there, or is it going to jinx you if I ask about this?
There is stuff we're talking about. I can say that.
Okay.
And it would be more in the film and TV vein. So I loved writing this book. I would love to do more kind of deep dive reporting, and I would say stay tuned.
I enjoyed the heck out of this one. I will pick up your next book for sure. So Scott,
thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on.
I so appreciate it. It's truly my pleasure. This was a blast.
And that was Scott Meslow. His new book is From Hollywood with Love, The Rise and Fall and Rise Again of the Romantic Comedy. It's from Day Street Books. That's D-E-Y. It's available wherever you buy books, and it'll make a great Valentine's Day gift. You've only got a couple of days before then if you're listening to this in real time. So go check it out and go get it for your sweetie. Also, check out Scott's website, scottmeslow.com, which has links to the book, but also his online and print magazine writing, including some great profiles he's done of actors. And it turns out I'd read a bunch of those profiles without knowing who had been writing them, including a great Timothy Oliphant story that he has. Anyway, his website has the story of how he wound up with the massive weapons chest from the first John Wick movie without the weapons in it. Anyway, that is SCOTTMESLOW.com. He's also on Twitter as Scott Meslow, all one word. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this guy doing these really neat interviews with creative folk every single week, seemingly without ever taking a week off, even though it seems to be riding him into the ground. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Tell people about the show is what I'm saying. I don't do the show for the numbers, but, I do like hearing from people who've discovered it and gone through the archives and found neat conversations that they never thought they'd hear. So you can also help the show out by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie or TV show or book or comic or piece of art or theater or exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners onto. And you can do that by sending me an email. You could try to DM me on Twitter or Instagram. Send me a postcard. Send me a letter. I send postcards out to people every day now. It's part of my 2022 thing. And I just think I always like when I hear from people, when I get a card in the mail. So I decided I would give that to everybody else, even if they're inscrutable and people can't necessarily tell from the handwriting that it's from me. But neither here nor there. The other way you can leave me some feedback is to leave a message on my Google Voice number, and that is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in a conversation with me. Messages can be up to 3 minutes long, and then it cuts you off. So if you're going to go real long, think about that in advance. And let me know if it's okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. I would never include that without your approval, but, if you do leave a message and you want to say something that you want the listeners to hear, just tell me. Now, if you have money to spare, don't give it to me. The show doesn't cost very much. My resources are just fine, even with this fancy new lounge chair that's showing up. But if you do have money to spare, I hope you'll support individuals and institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Tapato Go, Kickstarter. There are a couple of other crowdfunding models out there or platforms out there that you can use to support people. If you're looking to start with institutions or foundations, I'd recommend your local food bank, the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, election funds. There are a lot of things that you can do with your time and money to help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.